Welcome to the Interlocutor Podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Dr. Michael Huffman. Michael is an American who grew up in Colorado, where he spent his childhood pursuing a fascination with the natural world around him. As a young man, he moved to Japan to study the Japanese language, and he also began showing an interest in primatology. Through a lot of initiative and effort, he pursued an education in this field and became a scientist in Japan, working at the Primatology Research Institute at Kyoto University. He's published numerous scientific articles, which have received over 10,000 citations in the academic literature, and he's contributed to the publication of many books, notable among them a collection of papers called A Study of Primate Self-Medication, a field Michael has been instrumental in establishing. Today he joins me to talk about his intriguing career and to share some valuable lessons about where curiosity and hard work can take one. Dr. Michael Huffman, welcome, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Tyrell. I'm very happy to join you today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to speak with you. So I understand you have the nickname Monkey Mike, and I'm wondering how far back does that nickname go?
As far as I remember, junior high school.
Junior high school?
Yeah, I told my mom when I was about 4 years old, that I'm going to Africa and live with chimpanzees. So monkeys on the brain has been a lifelong state of mind for me, I think. But it's developed with time over the years.
So you, as a kid, you had a natural fascination with nature, the world around you, and Colorado's a great place to experience that, so close to the Rocky Mountains.
Right.
You grew up in Denver, in the city. What kind of opportunities were available to you to get outside of the city and explore nature when you were a kid?
Well, I found a lot of nature in my own neighborhood to start off with, but as a family, we'd go up into the mountains for barbecues and whatnot. And I think it was in junior high school that I found an opportunity through a local church, not the church that my parents went to, but in the neighborhood, who offered the opportunity for young kids to go hiking with an adult sponsor. So I forget the man's name, but there was like 3 or 4 of us who would go with him every once in a while up into the mountains and go on nature hikes. Mm-hmm. Then I entered the Colorado Mountaineering Club and started off on regular hikes and things so that they know what you're capable of. And then I gradually worked my way up so that I could eventually lead hikes. I was often the youngest person in the group in junior high school, in high school by then, but I was leading groups up on routes and things, climbing mountains and whatnot. At the end of junior high school, I had the opportunity to spend 2 weeks at the Vail Mountaineering School. And so I was basically a camp boy and a carrier of heavy things for the clients, but I got some lessons from the professional climbers that were there as staff on how to climb mountains, how to rock climb and things. So I got started earlier with technical climbing and things like that, but it was always linked with an awe for nature and to be up above the tree line and just breathe this cold, fresh air and hug a pine tree every once in a while.
Yeah. And it's something you continued pursuing like all throughout your teenage years, and you did some quite advanced climbs by the end of high school. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. That was my peak of technical rock climbing. I think I continued into college as an undergraduate, and then a little bit as a graduate student. But I got so busy with field work and whatnot, so I kind of tapered off. But I still go up and climb mountains, and I've been to the Himalayas and climbed in Europe and whatnot. But
when you were in high school, is that when you started working at the local zoo? as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was through the Boy Scouts, through the a program called Explorer Scouts, and you could pick a profession that you were interested in, and you could work with the people on the weekends. And I was really interested in animals from a very, very young age, so I learned that there was an opportunity to do that at the Denver Zoo. So for 3 years in high school, one day on the weekend I was at the zoo, and the other day I was up on a mountain or hanging from a cliff or something. But I spent my weekends with those two activities, and I did spend a lot of time at the zoo. I made good friends with a lot of people that I'm still in contact with. And
Hmm.
when I was still in the States, and when I would go back to visit the States, I'd always go to the Denver Zoo and meet up with folks. It was really a good opportunity to see the captive side of animals, and the captive side of conservation. So I think I got a very balanced view of animals in the natural world and the role of zoos um, to promote conservation, things like that. Yeah, it was a
Hmm.
very good time of my development, I think, to be able to interact with people and animals in that condition as well.
Yeah. So I grew up in the on the prairies in central Canada, and
Ah,
in small town there, I had quite a localized upbringing, and I don't remember having such a broad or wider sense of the world and different places, maybe a little bit from movies, but mostly growing up there was this season we play this sport and you repeat it next
mhm.
year. And that was sort of the upbringing. But I I think with you having such a fascination with monkeys, primates, that growing up you probably had a different sense of wanting to study the world and see where is it possible I can go here or here and study this animal. So is that uh, the kind of awareness you had of the world growing up?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Some when I tell this story, some people think, what's going on here? But I have early memories of being an old man. I don't know if it's because I hung out and talked a lot with my elder family members, my grandfather, my great uncles, or something else. But I often felt that I had been on this planet before, and
Hmm.
it was somewhere else, not in Colorado. So I was always thinking about that and always wanting to see the world. Um, I most of my relatives immigrated from Europe and during the 1800s. So I learned a lot about the pioneering days and the exploration of the West. So I was very keen on indigenous cultures. I learned a lot about indigenous cultures. I made crafts and clothes and things from deer skin and whatnot. I was just really interested in other cultures. And
Hmm.
in elementary school, I studied Spanish for 1 year. We had the opportunity to study French or Spanish. In high school, I studied German for 3 years. I was thinking on going to Germany to to get an education in ethology. But I grew up with Japanese American friends in our neighborhood. They were the first people outside of the house, friends out of the house that I remembered. And then I was just always attracted to people from other backgrounds and people coming from overseas. And I thought that I needed to do the same. I was impressed with how they adapted and everything. And I wanted to do the same. So all of
Mm.
my buddies were saving money to buy a car, and I was saving money to buy an airplane ticket. And
Interesting.
I bought my first ticket for the summer after graduating from high school and went to the Caribbean and studied vervet monkeys for 2.5, 3 weeks. And I
Yeah,
never stopped.
that was in 1977, right? That you
Right,
did that trip when you were 18.
right.
I'm interested in the 70s. How did you come across an opportunity like this and be able to do this? How was it possible, and how did you
Yeah.
discover the possibility?
Well, one of my uncles as a Christmas present to the family, gave us National Geographic this was like in the 60s. So I was always going through that every issue that came. So I was always thinking that, if I want to do research, then I'll work with National Geographic or Jacques Cousteau. Those were the two major wildlife programs in the days, and I was always sitting in front of the TV taking notes. I had a bunch of notebooks. It was my classroom basically. So I first wrote to National Geographic and said, "Hey, I'm almost ready to graduate from high school, and I want to go and study primates in the wild. I'm interested in chimpanzees, in great apes, chimpanzees in particular. I want to go to Africa." So I got back a couple letters. I would ask some more questions when one response came back that I wasn't quite satisfied with. So I wrote again, and they recommended that I try what's called the Expedition Training Institute. Nowadays, it's kind of like Earthwatch, but it was they would set up students or interested people with researchers who were able to host people to gain experience and to help in their projects. And I wrote back and forth to National Geographic, and they said they suggested I write to Expedition Training Institute, and I got a catalog, and they had some places, and they had Africa there, and I was interested in Africa, but because I wasn't even graduated from high school yet, they said, well, maybe something like this is more suitable for you. So they offered the opportunity to go to St. Kitts. That was a project run out of the University of California, Irvine, in Los Angeles. I'm sorry. So I started writing with those people, and it got me set up, and I went and had a great time. And the funny thing, I had a lot of side jobs from junior high school. One through leather carving. I would make belts and purses and things for people's birthdays. I would get orders. So I shoveled snow. I mowed lawns and all this in junior high school. So I slowly built up an amount of money in my bank account that I was a free man. I could I could fund my own climbing adventures. I could buy my own equipment. So I always had a lot of different jobs to save money. So I started writing to all of these places, not telling my parents exactly what I had in mind. So after I finally got the opportunity and I was about to send my $550 check to Expedition Training Institute, I asked my mom if it was okay if I went. And she said, "How are you going to pay for that?" "I got money, Mom." So they were happy that I was pursuing my dreams, but they were a bit surprised that this quiet little boy who did a lot of leather work in his room after school before going to work, after coming back from a side job, had already set up all of this. But they were very supportive. And so I just took that advantage, and that opened doors, and I made some of my first primatologist friends that way, and just never looked back. Then that summer I went, and then the next fall I entered university, and I had the opportunity through the university to come to Japan for a 6-month exchange program. But I knew that 6 months was not going to be enough. And I went.
I'm interested in what was it about Japan or the language that drew you to going there? Was it that was the program that was available, or was there something about Japan specifically that drew you to go there?
Yeah,
a
lot of different things work together. I found it's easy to look back in life and see how connections and things are intertwined, and how one person leads you to another person, one idea leads you to another idea. At the time, it all seemed like the stars were just finally lining up, and I had the stairs to walk to get to where I wanted to be. But my connection with Japanese culture and whatnot, as I mentioned earlier, began as a very young boy through my neighborhood buddies. We would hang out with each other in each other's houses. I'd go to my friend Dick and Gary Tazawa's place and walk in there. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad." And they say, "Hey, what's going on? How about some lunch, or how about some dinner? We're just getting ready for that." So very, very close relationship, friendship with these people. And so I was very attracted to the Japanese culture and whatnot. And the way of thinking as well, I found in science was more towards my thinking than the Western, in those days, the Western ideas of science, were humans being above the rest of the animals. That was the anthropological view. That was, the scientific view, was that humans are superior to all the other animals. Whereas in Eastern traditions, more on equal level in some ways. And I grew up with animals with a dog, with several dogs and cats as I was growing up, and so I knew better than to think that animals were living on pure instinct. They had no emotions. They had no self-recognition. They had no capacity to plan and all. I knew animals on a much closer relationship, and I took that into my science. So when I got to Japan, it took 15 months to finish the program. It was originally, like I said, for 6 months, a 3-month program with the possibility to extend over summer break. But already by then I was taking the next level of classes, and I was meeting with scientists at the university that I was at, making connections and learning to read and write technical scientific Japanese. And it was around that time that I realized that Japan had this great long tradition of primatology, and the founders were just right one train ride away from where I was going to school. So I was introduced that way. But when I finally met the professors that I eventually worked with, who became my mentors, Professor Junichiro Itani, Professor Masao Kawai, Shunzo Kawamura, very nice people, very, very energetic, very open, very sharing of their ideas and places that they work. I knew after meeting them that this is where I was meant to be, and this is where I could fulfill my desire to study primates, to go to Africa. Professor Itani was one of the earliest pioneers studying great apes in Africa. So it was a combination of all these things, my upbringing, my experiences when I was young, and what I felt as a very similar way of thinking and approaching science, that made it very easy for me to decide this is where I was supposed to be.
Great. And I want to pick up on that and talk more about that subject you were just explaining there. But I think before we go that direction, you continued with a lot of self-initiative when you were in Japan by going out into nature on your own, not part of any program necessarily, and studying monkeys just independently and learning how to do this, how to be around them. It was Arashiyama.
Arashiyama, yeah.
And Iwatayama Monkey Park near Kyoto.
Right.
So you would go up onto the mountain and spend 3 or 4 days living near the monkeys, and then come back down into the city and work for some time.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
That must have been a really exciting experience, being able to do this. And you're a young man, and you're basically living your dream in
exactly
many ways.
Every day was living the dream. Yeah. And it was because of the generosity and support of a lot of people here in Japan. Professor Itani had a student who was just finishing up his master's at Arashiyama. And he suggested that, if you're interested in monkeys, you're here in Japan, go look at these monkeys at Arashiyama. And the advice that he gave me when to start the work was to become a monkey. Before you get other people's ideas about how they behave and what they're doing and how it's supposed to be, go there and see for yourself. immerse yourself in their daily lives. So that's exactly what I did. They would eat something, I would take a piece and see how it tasted. Because when I was a kid, that's how I survived in the neighborhood during summer. I just kind of foraged on fruits and different things that were in season at the time. Like I had my regular travel route. So when I started studying primates, I realized how much of a primate that I was. I was basically behaving like our monkey relatives were. So I spent 12 months on the mountain, as you mentioned. I thanks to the generosity of the director of the park, Nobuo Asaba, he said, stay in this in this cabin up here close to the feeding station. I've set this place up, and sometimes researchers come and they can spend a couple nights while they're doing work. But you're a poor young student, and you're obviously not spending a lot of money on food. You're skinny, and come here and save money on train fare, and I'll take you out to dinner once in a while. So he was very, very generous. He was like my second father. He had two sons, very similar age to mine. So it was really, really a nice opportunity that I took him up on. And I would be woken up in the morning when the monkeys started bouncing on the tin roof, and I'd follow them all day. They'd go into the mountains. I'd go back to the cabin. I'd arrange my field notes, make some dinner. It's dark, and then I'd go back up into the mountains to find out where they were sleeping, and then I'd spend a couple hours seeing what they do at night, so I could understand the whole thing. So it was wonderful. Yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out too that from this stage to the point of becoming let's say a credentialed scientist, you had to work really hard to get to that stage. You went back to the States and did an undergraduate in science, and then moved back to Kyoto and did a master's degree and a PhD. This takes a lot of time and effort, and with things like writing to institutes to try and request funding to all the years of study. And those were they difficult years getting to that position, or the whole time were you thinking, I mean, this is what I have to do to fulfill my goal?
Yeah, basically, yeah, just what you said. That for me, I learned early on through mountain climbing and just growing up that it's important to have a goal, but reaching that goal is it's the end product of the process, and the process, how you do it, what effort you put in to get where you want to go is what's important. That determines how solid the final product is. So I never really I enjoyed every minute. And I still do. I still have lots of big dreams and goals and things, and I don't think about finally reaching the end. It's the whole process that's a joy to partake in. So, it's living life from day to day in one way, but taking advantage of all the opportunities and insights that you gain along the way makes the final product that much more solid and that much more interesting, I think, because a lot happens in that process. It took me 10 years to get tenure, to get a job in a Japanese university, but that was the goal from 1979 when I first started studying at Arashiyama. When I realized what the possibilities were, I was willing to put in the time and get there. There was a lot of sacrifices of course, but I always compromised where I needed, but I didn't compromise where I didn't have to. And I was lucky. I had opportunities. I always had enough money to eat. I always had a roof over my head, but I didn't always pay the rent for that roof. Sometimes friends let me stay at their place until I had enough money to rent my own apartment, for example. But there were always, always opportunities, always kind people, and I was willing to put in the effort, because the effort itself was part of the goal.
The primatology tradition that you were joining in the early 80s had established quite a prestigious reputation already by that time. So maybe we could talk a little about the background of how that developed and what you were joining in the 1980s. I'm interested in learning a little about the potato washing monkeys, and also something that I read in one of your papers that was called The Lessons of History and Tradition on Becoming a Monkey and Other Insights Gained as a Primatologist in Japan. In this paper, you talk about how primatology got established in the late 40s, early 50s, and you pointed to two key methodologies, as you call them in the paper, but practices of how the Japanese scientists were approaching primatology, and that was the practice of individual identification of the animals and long-term genealogical data, basically following the families generation after generation.
Right.
Could you talk about how those approaches were quite unique at the time that the Japanese tradition were establishing them?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
When in those days, there were very few field primatologists in the world. There were people who had gone out and done some short-time studies. Clarence Carpenter was probably the first field primatologist, and he went to several parts around the world to study species for a certain period of time, short periods of time. He was in Central America. He went to India, Southeast Asia. But in the end, he collected a group of rhesus macaques from India and took them to the Caribbean and put them on an island called Cayo Santiago. And that they started long-term research there. But they, instead of individual identification, they just put numbers. They tattooed numbers on the individuals to be unbiased in their view. So they, as individual scientists, I don't know, but I imagine that they probably learned some to recognize some of the individuals, but they had a huge colony, so it was easier for them just to write down number 23 did this to number 41 and this and that. And in their thinking, that would not bias their interpretations of behavior. But the Japanese saw it in a completely different way. They recognized that there were family units within societies of many different animals. They started off studying horses, not primates, not Japanese monkeys, but they were interested in looking at the social aspects, social relationships, and trying to understand social structure and organization. One of the early goals when they started going to Africa was to look at the origin of the human family. So they started to study gorillas, and then moved to chimpanzees, and then both lines of research continued, and they went into other monkey species. But some of the earliest, most insightful things in primatology, I think, came out of the Japanese work because they were recognizing the role of kinship in how individuals interact, and how that kinship can attract and also repel individuals from associating with each other. The way that it encourages animals to avoid each other is a very, very basic, very important aspect of biology, and that's to avoid inbreeding, incest avoidance. And that's a very important part of the social organization and social structure of any animal that lives in groups. But they started looking at that from the perspective of the primates. And at Arashiyama, a very nice example there, they started out very basic kinds of things, weighing animals and looking at a development and whatnot. But they gave names to every individual. They started off with, I think, 27 individuals in this small original population. But it grew because they were provisioned. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. But they maintained those genealogies, and they're maintained to this day. Started in 1954. To this day, every individual born into the group, every individual that disappears or that dies, it's recorded. So we know the exact relationships of all family members extending through the lifetime of any member alive today. We can say, oh, that's the second cousin, third cousin, that's the great aunt, that's the grandmother, that's the great grandmother. And knowing all of those relationships, we can see how similarly they act to humans. Humans have every social organization of every primate on the planet. It's a combination of different things culturally maintained in different societies, whereas it's often species specific or environmentally influenced that you can have certain of these types of social organization. It's either a matriline or a patriline, things like that. But at Arashiyama, because they had all this information, when individuals disappeared, they began to notice that young males were the ones who were leaving the group, and the females stayed in that group for life. It was always the males that would leave. And when a population fissioned, when they split up along matrilines. And within matrilines, males that were mature or maturing, they would end up in a group without their female kin. And another very interesting thing that was first discovered at Arashiyama, at a certain point, one of the early researchers decided to study another population on the other side of Kyoto City, just behind Kyoto University, up on the mountains there in Mount Hiei. And he was trying to habituate the group over there. And one day, this young male appears that he knew from Arashiyama. And that was the first time that they realized that when males leave their group, they just don't become solitary wanderers, outcasts of society. They enter another group and become reproductive members of that group. And Pazama-san, the researcher, was able to follow that process of entering into a new group and establishing himself within the hierarchy, and eventually became an alpha male. So that was the first awareness of how inbreeding is avoided, and how individuals form societies, become members of different societies within their species. A lot of that is known how humans do this, and that's about marriage, trends in marriage and different patterns like that. But they realize that animals have the same system. And without that understanding of kinship, scientists in the West were late in understanding some of those things. But now, the world over, people look at these things as very basic concepts. Individually identifying each member of a group is common practice now.
And when one animal would leave and join another group, when we talk about these two different groups, is it right to say that these are distinct societies and they see each other as us versus them the same way that human groups do? Or similar to that? Yeah.
They maintain territories, and in most species, in Japanese macaques definitely, they maintain territories and exclude others. And when even monkeys who had lived together all of their lives, if the group splits up, then all of a sudden it's us and them. They're a different group, and they're not allowed to feed in the same place, feed on the same food, so they get excluded. The subordinate group becomes excluded, and they set up their own territory somewhere else. But you'll have exchange of individuals mating in the opposite group, or they'll move further away, and eventually, they're absorbed in the larger genetic population, but it's all outbreeding in that way.
One of the famous stories with I think it's Japanese macaques, is that right? Is the experiment done many years ago where they put sweet potatoes, a food that they liked, in the sand, and correct me if I'm wrong, but were they trying to incentivize them to wash the potatoes by doing the experiment in this way?
No, that
no?
wasn't even an experiment for that purpose.
Okay.
That they just the island of Koshima down in Miyazaki Prefecture on the southwest coast of Kyushu, they spread out sweet potatoes on the beach because it's an island, but a very steep island, and the monkeys could easily get away. It was hard to observe them. So they decided that they would, this started in 1951, 52. And so the monkeys came down and they would pick up the potatoes, and some would just brush off with their hand what they could. But because it happens on the beach and the tide comes in and out, there's rivulets of water that come down from the mountain, but there's also water that comes in and is kept in these little pools and things until it eventually disappears. And one of the local people involved, a young woman at the time, noticed that one of the monkeys picked up one of these sandy potatoes and put it in the water, and then picked it up and ate it. And she alerted the researchers to it, and they started looking at it, and then they studied the spread. And this was all done by the three scientists who I mentioned, who I first met and who I studied under, Professor Ikitani, Professor Kawai, and Professor Kawamura. At the time, they were undergraduate students. So it was through the opportunistic events that they began to look at the process of how that behavior spread, and then how it became more complicated, how they used different techniques, even for other food sources, to try and separate the sand from the food.
In social learning that occurs in this way, or even we might call it a kind of culture even. How do the young generation learn to do these behaviors? Do they just observe and eventually try it themselves, or what's the process that those skills are developed in the next generation?
In almost all instances, it's observational learning. The young watches someone else. It depends on the behavior itself. The direction of transmission can change, but often in the beginning, it's young individuals who do something out of the norm or try something new, and it'll spread amongst peers, those that are together when that activity is most likely to happen. So in the case of potato washing, which is a food eating, it's a food preparation strategy. Everyone eats, so the opportunity for everyone to see is there. But the first opportunities, especially for young individuals, are usually their siblings or their mother. That's who they spend the most time with. And because this young female, she was about 3.5 years of age when she was first observed to wash the sand off the potatoes, it spread to her mother and to her aunts and her siblings. So it kind of went up, and then back down in the next generations. When Imo became a mother, it passed on to her offspring, and all these others, when they became mothers, it passed down in the form of cultural transmission from one generation to the next. But the initial pattern of diffusion can change.
Mm.
A behavior that I started studying in 1979 when it first began to spread at Arashiyama is called stone handling. And in that case, because it's a solitary object play behavior and it was being practiced by the young, when others are playing or associating with each other, then it spread horizontally. It didn't go up because adults were hanging out with their offspring when they're playing like that. They're feeding or they're taking care of their young infants or doing something else. So it spread amongst the same age group. And as those females reached maturity, then it spread 100% to all of their offspring.
Interesting. A few years ago now, I had the pleasure and the opportunity to join a small conservation team in Madagascar. And I was just there as an observer. I was doing a travel book about that place, but I was able to join this group for a week or so, and we went in, hiked up this mountain to a rainforest in northeastern Madagascar, where the scientist and his local colleagues they're trying to protect a rainforest there because there's not much original rainforest left in Madagascar. And one of the reasons he's doing this is because he studies one of the lemurs there and the different calls that it makes. But what was interesting for me joining this group was seeing just how much logistical work goes into the preparation beforehand and carrying all kinds of equipment and provisions and things into the camp and spending time there. In the 1980s, you went to a place in western Tanzania. It's Mahale National Park. It's this mountainous area near a large lake,
Lake Tanganyika.
Yes,
yeah.
I'm interested to know what kind of work goes into the preparation to do something big like that. How do you provision yourself, and how do you get established at a base camp? And then I'm also interested in some of the field techniques that you do and how you stay safe working with such large, potentially dangerous animals.
When I started working at Mahale, the site had already been established since 1980. Well, actually, since 1965. It started off with one researcher, Toshisada Nishida, then at Kyoto University. And he was living in a village, and the chimpanzees were coming sometimes close to the village, but they would also go out into the mountains to find them with sugarcane to attract them to come. But by the time that I started in 1985, it was already 10 plus years, almost 20 years. That's the chimps that I started studying. That research started in 1981. They habituated another group when the group they were initially studying basically was exterminated by M group, the larger group. So a lot of known individuals moved into M group, all females, the opposite of Japanese monkeys in their social organization. So we already had buildings up in the mountains with beds and when I first started, it was dirt floors, it was mud walls and tin roofs. It got better over time, or it improved over time. But we still had to bring all of our food for several months at a time in by boat because there's no roads coming to the park. And it's only about 75 kilometers down the lake. But in those days, we had like a 40 5 horsepower engine, which takes you slowly down the lake. On a good day, on very calm waters, a good night, we would go at night when the winds calm down. It would take about 10 hours to get into camp.
Wow.
On a normal day during the rainy season, it would take up to 24 hours, sometimes longer, because we'd have to pull off and save the boat from capsizing or being crashed into the rocks or something. But we put all of our food, we have to put enough petrol in the boat to get us back to town the next time, and some, because we had to run generators sometimes. We had to bring in kerosene for lamps and things for lighting. In those days, we didn't have solar power or anything. Those days were better than when we had solar power, actually, because solar power at night makes everything too bright and you get all these bugs that come and get in your food and, all over the place. So a very, very nice kerosene lamp is the perfect way to read a book before going to bed. It slowly puts you to sleep. It's just the ambience is much nicer. So we had a lot of preparation, which involved a lot of interactions with people in Kigoma, the last town on the edge of Tanzania to Lake Tanganyika, in that part of Tanzania. Jane Goodall would go north from Gombe to her site. It's about an hour and a half, and we would go south for 10 plus hours to get to our site. And basically the methodologies that we used in Mahale was the same that I used in Arashiyama. We would follow identified individuals. We would do long-term observations of each individual over the day and then over the year, and we would continue over the years to gather information, depending on what our study topic was. We would always go in a team, and we would each have a tracker, a local assistant who grew up in that forest, who lived there before it became a national park, and they were all unfortunately pushed out. So they knew the area, they knew the animals, they knew the habits, they knew the plants, which was very important for my future work there. And we all carried machetes because the forest can be quite dense in some places, and in order to cut your way through to get to where you wanted to go, you needed that. The animals, the chimpanzees that I was studying were very habituated to humans already, so it was easy to follow them. We could get fairly close, and they would actually come close to us, not necessarily seeking our attention, but just because we were all in a common area to rest. For example, if they're hunting, we could be within meters of them as they're grabbing onto red colobus and tearing them apart. We could really see up close. Wow. Without influencing what they did to a large extent. And there's a lot of other wild animals there. There's leopards. At one time, for a period of like 2 years, there were lions who climbed over the mountain and were out of their normal habitat, which is usually the savannas. They were in this forest and they were hunting chimps.
Really?
So we had to be very careful in those days. We would go out in groups, and one of the trackers would carry a rifle just in case we stumbled upon a lion that wanted to eat us instead of a chimp. So there were some tense times, but after the first few months, the first time that I went there, you become more relaxed and more attuned to everything around you. There's a lot of poisonous snakes, spitting cobras, green mambas, who, there's no antidote that we could carry with us that had to be refrigerated. We didn't have refrigerators in those days. So it was risky to go in, but again, it was living the dream, and we all had goals. We all had things we wanted to be there for. So we just learned to adapt like we learned from our local counterparts what to look after, what rivers you can directly drink from, what rivers to stay away from, what plants not to touch, and what fruit really tastes good. I learned a lot of that from watching the chimps. And so you just gradually become part of that habitat. And I started thinking, I learned how to feed and move around in my neighborhood. A lot of it was experimentation. A lot of it was learning from older kids in our group of playmates and whatnot. What's any different here in Africa? It's the background. It's the home area of my new friends here. So, you just adapt and it all becomes very familiar in the end.
Interesting. And you mentioned collaboration with locals. One day when you were observing an ill chimpanzee and you were with a local who had some knowledge of the flora of the area, you saw this chimpanzee eat a leaf that was known to be bitter and not part of their natural diet. And eventually you were able to develop this theory that, or I guess we can call it theory, of that they were self-medicating, and this really grew into a prominent topic of study for scientists around the world. Could you talk about how you made that discovery?
Sure. This was with Mohammedi Saif Kalunde. He was one of the trackers who was on the project from the very beginning when Professor Junichiro Itani started work in Mahale. Mohammedi was one of their assistants. I think he was maybe 16, 17 years old at the time. And he was trained in traditional medicine by his mother, his grandfather. He's part of a long lineage of herbalists. There are different types of healers or doctors. There are those that use rituals and religion, sometimes plant drugs for hallucinogens, to commune with the spirits. It's a way of seeking information wherever that's coming from. And there's others that are more herbalists who use the chemical properties of plants to treat very specific illnesses. Mohammedi was from that lineage. They were basically herbal doctors. His skills with that, and before I started working with him in our scientific work, weren't recognized. I don't think anyone appreciated his knowledge about that, but he knew a lot about all the plants. So he and our other trackers would give us the names of the plants in the local dialect in Kitongwe, and we would talk to each other and to them about the plants in their vernacular. But we also put together a list, so we had the Latin names that we could use for scientific papers, so we could converse with other scientists about. But Mohammed and I were following a small group of chimps. At that time, I was studying the role of elder chimpanzees in society. And to do that, I needed to compare their behavior, their social networks, with those of younger adult individuals. So Chao Shiku, this female who turned out to be sick on that day, she was associating with some of the individuals that I was following as part of my study subjects. Chao Shiku was a very charismatic chimp in the eyes of researchers, because she was often written about for different things that she did. One, she transferred from K group into M group, and she came with other females from that group. So they were interested in how females integrate themselves within a new group when they come. So there's been a lot of papers that focused on several particular female chimpanzees, and Chao Shiku was one of them. So I would usually record what all the individuals were doing, interacting with my focal animals. So Mohammed and I were following this small group and focusing on one female. But when Chaoshiku came back down from the tree, it was curious. She gave her infant to these females, and they went off feeding, and Chaoshiku climbed up into a tree and built a nest and was sleeping. This was before noon, so it's like they just got up a couple hours before, but she's already... I didn't think much about it because I was focused on this other female. But after these females came back and waited for Chaoshiku to climb down, and they gave the infant back to her, they started moving, and she went and ate this plant that I hadn't seen them eat before. And she was eating the pith, not the leaves. But the pith and the leaves are very bitter. And in English, that plant across Africa is known as bitter leaf. Humans use the leaf as a tonic food, but they also use the leaf as a treatment for malaria, for gastrointestinal upsets. It's very efficient in reducing blood sugar level, so it's used as a treatment for diabetes. It's an antibiotic. It's got anti-cancer properties, just full of all kinds of different activities. Some of those which we discovered once we started doing the pharmacology on that plant to understand what it could possibly have done for Chaoshiku. But Mohammed and I followed Chaoshiku over a 2-day period. Once she ate bitter pith, then I said, okay, we got to figure this out, because Mohammed, he said it's medicine for people. And I started thinking back about the bits and pieces of her behavior that morning that I observed, and then what it could lead to. By the end of that day, she was in a sleeping nest very early. She was having difficulty defecating. Her urine was dark. A lot of different signs showed that she wasn't at her best, and she wasn't. Other chimps, we never seen this. I had never seen the same kind of symptoms. So she stood out as possibly being sick. So I said, we have to follow her tomorrow and see what happens. See if this Vernonia actually has some positive effect. Does she get better? Does she get worse? Just what does she do? And how do these other individuals interact with her? Are they helping her in some way? They looked after her infant on that first day. What's going to happen the next day if she can't take care of herself? So we found her the next morning, and she had moved very, very little from where we left her the night before, early night before. And we started following her. And again, she was not very well. She didn't eat a whole lot, very, very little, in fact. But she didn't eat any more Vernonia. She just had that one dose that first day. And around noontime, she caught up with others, and they were all together sleeping for their afternoon siesta. So we settled in, just relaxed, knowing that she's not going to get up and go anywhere very quickly. But she did. The others were still sleeping. She got up and took off. She pounded on the ground to get her infant to come and follow her. Ended up grabbing her and putting her son on her back, and they went off. Mohammed and I ran to keep up with her. This went on for almost an hour until she ended up in the swamp area close to the lake, and she spent the next 2 hours or so feeding. That was the first time she had eaten that much in 2 days. She had obviously had regained her strength. We had to run to keep up with her. So it seemed very clear that something made her quite well quite rapidly. So I got interested in this plant. I started asking Mohammedi and others in the community what they use the plant for, and it became clear that they use it for very similar symptoms that Chaoshiku was showing, and they use it as a treatment for malaria. They use it as a treatment for parasites, for stomach upset, and their recovery is about 20 to 24 hours, just like Chaoshiku. So this really got my attention. So I collected some of the leaves and the pith. I dried them. I took them back to Kyoto and found some plant chemists who were interested in working with me to try and understand the properties of this plant. And I started talking with people at the Pasteur Institute in Kyoto. What next can I do to try and figure out what made Chaoshiku sick? What should I be looking for? How can I monitor? How can I assay different things that will tell me about her health? So I developed all of these techniques and tools to wait for the next opportunity to try and see another chimp use the plant. So I became a parasitologist. I became an ethnobotanist. I started talking to people about plants, how they use them for medicine, how they learn about these things. Do they know about animals using medicine, like I think Chaoshiku was doing? So we developed this methodology, and we began to focus not only on bitter pith chewing, but on some other behaviors that were different that people didn't quite understand, but thought that maybe they had some medicinal value. So basically, I started the field of animal self-medication, the protocol and the things that we had to prove, to put the case forward for self-medication. And then other people got really interested. They started looking in chimps and other sites. I started working with them. We started writing more papers, started looking at other species of primates. Last year, I wrote in collaboration with colleagues in Italy, we wrote our first paper on self-medication in porcupines.
Is that right?
And I'm collaborating with people now who are looking at self-medication in insects. And I'd say maybe in the mid 90s was I was convinced that every species on the planet has to be doing this. To get to the point to say that chimps were doing it was a big effort. People were saying half the population, oh, that's really cool. Yeah, they're just like us chimps. Yeah, of course, yeah. But a lot of scientists said, come on, you got to do more than just say that they did it. You have to demonstrate it, and you have to do it multiple times. So we kept at it, and we're able to convince a lot of scientists that there is something to this, and then we gave them the protocol how to do it. And today I've had several graduate students now from different universities that I've collaborated with, and from very few from Japan. None of my students here have stuck with self-medication studies. It's usually the people that I've mentored from outside. But now there's quite a large community of us looking at this in a whole variety of different species. So now it's just really like...
I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Now it's like, of course, it's so obvious that every animal should be doing this, whereas just a few years, 35 years, time flies, 35 years ago, it was so hard to convince people that this was happening. But with the evidence and thinking about what this really is, there can be no other way for animals to survive as a species and as individuals than to fight off these diseases that they're confronted with on a daily basis. Some are seasonal, some are not, but now it's just it can't be any other way, but animals are self-medicating themselves to control different threats to their environment. And we know now that those threats vary on the environment. You can have all the same parasites, but a particular parasite is a problem in one habitat with one type of seasonality, one type of ecology, but that parasite is not a problem in another part of the world where that species lives. But a different species is the problem. So they interact, they have the same techniques to treat different parasites. That's where we're at now, looking at those differences, and not just within primates, not just within chimpanzees, but we're finding similarities between very diverse taxa. For example, a behavior called leaf swallowing, where an animal will take a leaf that is covered in stiff hairs, and that's a defense mechanism of the leaf to prevent from being overgrazed on, basically to prevent the leaves from being eaten, because it makes them hard to digest. The hairs are very hard to digest. But the animals are going one step further, taking those properties, folding and swallowing without chewing. So they're taking this mass of things that won't digest, and what they're basically doing is decreasing the transit time through the gut. And what that does is rapidly push everything out, and they're pushing out parasites with it. We've seen this in eastern and western lowland gorillas, in all the subspecies of chimpanzees. We've seen it. This is another collaboration with an Italian colleague. We've seen it in gibbons in Southeast Asia. Over 20 years looking at orangutans, colleagues of mine, we've never found it there. But we see it. It's common in carnivores. I've collaborated with colleagues in Taiwan. We found it in civets. Very recently, students from Kyoto, from the Wildlife Research Center, a graduate student, has found that snow leopards are doing something similar to this. It was earlier reported a collaborator in Edmonton, at the University of Edmonton, a parasitologist, had seen similar behavior in brown bear and Canadian snow geese. And they linked that behavior to the expulsion of tapeworms. Chimpanzees are also expelling tapeworms with these leaves. They're expelling other worm species as well. So we're seeing similar strategies in quite different animal taxa, but the common ground is the parasite that is giving them the problems that they need to deal with.
It must have been incredibly exciting, coming across these discoveries and developing this field, and having the critics out there making you have to work hard to demonstrate, now this is a real phenomenon that's going on out there.
Yeah.
And it's expanded to all kinds of different biologists or zoologists are noticing this in their species of study. It's
right.
fascinating.
Yeah, it's amazing. I give lectures on this often in different parts of the world to people, and I'm trying to get people who are looking for a topic interested in the possibility of looking at self-medication, but they can study anything they want. But part of it is just to get them excited, as I am even now talking about these things, to get excited about science and to appreciate what animals are capable of and how much we have learned from them, not just as scientists, but Mohammed and his family have a long tradition of learning different medicines that they use from watching the behavior of animals. The wild boar, several other primate species. But these stories are everywhere around the planet. People have learned about drugs, uses of plants to treat common diseases from watching animals. And now this is kind of embedded in folk tales. So scientists tend to say, oh, that's just fanciful thinking, or, maybe it's something different. But when I put my protocol to it, investigating those cases, looking at the behavior of the animal, do they ingest those plants? Are they noted to ingest those plants? What are the properties of those plants? Could they actually have those effects on the animals? I just picked 14 randomly from around the world, different folk tales, and they all fit into one of the categories of self-medication. Again, this is one of these things that people have a hard time grasping sometimes, but I think very, very soon this will be another moment. Of course, yeah, let's keep looking at animals, and they have something to tell, something to teach us, something.
I have a couple more questions for you. One's more related to how being a primatologist has allowed you the opportunity to see so much of the world. You've conducted research basically every continent, and from South America to Africa and Europe and all over different parts of Asia. How have you enjoyed that part of your career and the opportunity to interact with so many different people, cultures, and places in the world?
Often people and places are what attract me to a new location to do studies.
Mm-hmm.
I love people. I've always been interested in other cultures, and when I was a very young boy, I was always hiding behind my mom's skirt. I was very shy, but I had these dreams that were much bigger than hiding behind my mom's skirt would allow to happen. And I just realized that no, I got to get out there. I have to open up. I have to you know see the world. And the first time when I went to the Caribbean, that was a new experience. It was the first time for me to get on an airplane. First time for me to travel like that far away on my own. First time to go east of Colorado, even within the United States. I got on an airplane and I went down to the Caribbean. And I did that once, and I got homesick, but I thought, darn, the next time I'm gonna deal with this a little bit differently. I went to Japan and I stayed for 3 years. The 6 months ended up 3 years, and I cried literally when I got on the plane to leave Japan because I didn't want to go, but I had to finish my undergraduate studies so I could come back and start my professional career, start my graduate studies. So I really made it my goal to become to feel at home wherever I am with whoever I'm with, to make the world my home, to make different cultures, to not to conquer, but to be conquered by all of the beauty and knowledge of the different cultures that I experience. So now going to a new place is fun, and I always expect to go back again. Once I make a friend, they're always a friend. So, gradually, this whole planet is home.
That's great. So my last question that I want to ask you, I'm interested to have you reflect on what we can learn about ourselves, what we can learn about humanity from the study of primatology. It's somewhat broad, but I think in some ways that's one of the purposes of the field. Not just that purpose, but what have you learned about our own species studying other primates?
Well, not even primates, just every animal species that I've looked at, and that's part of the beauty of biology. You see that continuity. That's the whole concept of evolution. To give you an example, at Mahale, there's a couple that established and ran this very nice tourist camp, and as one of their promotions, they had T-shirts that they would sell. And we sat down over some beer one night, saying, what's a good phrase to put on there? I've heard that humans and chimpanzees are really close genetically. How much is that, Mike? It's about 99 point something. Yeah. So on the front it says 98% chimpanzee, and I said, but wait a minute, what about other species? So I asked a botanist friend, how close are we to bananas, the food of chimpanzees? They don't eat bananas anyway. They eat the stalks, but not the bananas. He said, we're about 50%. So on the back of the T-shirt, 50% bananas. And something that I felt from very early on, that closeness to nature, that connection even to plants. What I've learned about humans through studying primates and studying other animals is that we stand on the shoulders of little giants. Some are bigger than us. Evolution is we're not the end point of evolution. We're an experiment within a random process that came up with who we are. But we would not be who we are without all the other species that evolved before us. Everything we think, I don't think, but everything humans want to think is unique about themselves is an extension of something that already existed in our relatives. And the fact that snow geese, brown bear, gorillas, chimps, gibbons, Japanese monkeys, leopards in Tanzania, lions in Tanzania, civets in Taiwan, all fold and swallow leaves. I mean, that's a very important connection that we all share. We all have some capacity to come up with that. So there are unique things about humans, but things that scientists have said in the past and even think about now as setting us apart from the animals, I think is not a very important question to be asking, because everything in the end we're figuring out that animals have other animals, we're animals too. Other animals have a capacity to do something similar in a different way, perhaps. So for me, what I've learned about myself or about humans is that we're not all that different. There are important differences, and that's great. But the similarities are what we should be looking at and should be appreciating if we want to coexist with other species on this planet, and if we want this planet to continue supporting us, because we're probably the only species that has that can ruin it for everybody. We need nature. Nature doesn't need us. We have to get that in our heads and behave accordingly, I think.
Oh, that was very well said. Thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. I enjoyed learning about your career. I think it's very inspiring, the initiative and effort that you put into developing it, and I think the success that you've enjoyed throughout it comes from that curiosity that you had as a young person, and matching that with hard work. It's an inspiration for what people can accomplish if they set their mind to it. So thank you very much for this.
You've done your homework very, very well. I'm surprised at all that you come up with. And I retired last month, but for me, retirement is putting new tires on the vehicle. You're on me, and I'm taking the same. I'm still on the same road. Always be curious. Always continue to do science in any way that I can, and to have those big dreams that keep me going, and enjoying the process. And I think that's important for everyone, no matter what they're doing. Even if it's not science, whatever you do, enjoy it. Enjoy the process, and you'll get good output from it. If we can't enjoy doing what we're doing, we should be doing something else and enjoy that.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure to speak to you today, Dr. Huffman. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tyrell. I appreciate it.